but we've watched this ever-shrinking killing cage be manufactured by the U.S. and Israel. It's like watching the Matrix, or some kind of Hunger Games for Palestinians that has been televised on live stream for more than 2 years. If you go back and you watch speeches or you understand the history of Joe Biden, whether he was fully with it or not, the Joe Biden of those 50 years was in charge of that Gaza genocide.
There is a crackdown in the USA on these kind of conversations.
Support for speech doesn't mean that you defend the right to speech that you agree with. It means you defend the right to speech that you disagree with. And this attempt to compare the Palestinian resistance to Al-Qaeda or ISIS is lunacy. This isn't a Hamas extremism. All Palestinian factions, with the exception of the clique around Mahmoud Abbas, are saying this is a neo-colonialist plan.
How do you think they could have navigated this space?
What military response could the Syrian government offer to a nuclear-armed power, backed, bankrolled, armed, and funded by the United States? Doctors are Hamas. Hospitals are Hamas command centers. Journalists are Hamas. Children are future Hamas. The Palestinians start lighting up, and it's first dozens, then hundreds, and as many as more than 2,000 Palestinians were killed while waiting or seeking aid.
Oh, it's okay.
Okay, are you happy with the headphones? You totally can take it off if you want.
I think I'm going to take it off.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really loud.
It is loud. And you don't really need it. Like, honestly, I don't need it after the beginning as always. Just keep it on in case the camera's turned off or something. Okay, we're good to start when you are. Yes. Hi, good day. Welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaq Kareem. Once again, coming you from Doha, we're at the Doha Forum, and I'm very pleased to announce to welcome to the show today, Jeremy Scahill. Jeremy, welcome.
My honor to be here.
Jeremy has really been one of the foremost journalists in the last 20 years, reporting on American empire, its expansion, its military expansion, its atrocities. From the work I've seen you do, Jeremy, it's thoroughly investigated, really high quality, and extremely impassioned.
Thank you.
And you've been someone we've been actually trying to get on the show for a while. We haven't had you not because we're just both busy, and both entities, Dropside News, that kind of started once this genocide was already underway, and really started just been running steam ahead. One of the great things about this forum is that we can actually meet each other in person and start talking. Jeremy, just before we get into the discussion today, which I want to be about how what's happened in Gaza is very much an expansion of the U.S. foreign policy and the way it's conducted war in the last 20 years. And I think you're probably one of the people who are key to speak about this. But before we get there, just if there's one lesson, and it's probably difficult to take this down to one lesson, but if there's one lesson that you've learned about the world in the last 24 months, what is it?
Look, the world, particularly young people and people of conscience, are more awake now than I think they've been in your lifetime and my lifetime to the reality of what the Zionist project in the Middle East is actually about, to what the relationship between the United States and Israel actually amounts to. The level of knowledge that exists now in the world about the 100-year struggle for independence and self-determination of the Palestinian people, this is an unprecedented moment. We're also seeing a massive conflict where you have most of the nations and peoples of the world seeing clearly that Israel is not just committing a genocide in Gaza, but is effectively a serial killer masquerading as a nation state. And the United States is still holding on to its dedication to Israel as its satellite in the region. But there are real questions that I think the world is now understanding of who's actually in control of the agenda. Is Israel in control of the U.S. agenda in the Middle East, or is the U.S. in control of Israel? What Trump is doing right now with his so-called 20-point plan, in a way, is rescuing Israel's war of annihilation from itself because of what I'm saying, because the world is so awake, because the objections from across the globe are so strong. Trump, I think, calculated that Israel was becoming bad for its own mission to annihilate the Palestinian people. So we can talk in depth about what that 20-point plan says and the concerns about it. But the point that I would emphasize is that we shouldn't call it a ceasefire. We should remain vigilant in keeping our eye not just on Gaza, but the war of ethnic cleansing and extermination happening in the occupied West Bank. And remember that the United States is now operating with a fake illegitimate stamp of approval from the United Nations Security Council to do something unprecedented. The deployment of an armed force that is not blue helmets, that is not under the auspices of the United Nations, but is under the control of a private board with the Orwellian name, the Board of Peace, the director of which is Donald Trump, and with no exit date defined. So we're at this remarkable moment in history where the world sees clearly, and the United States, even though Trump is an erratic, inconsistent character, really has tried to save Israel from itself so that they can continue their war of annihilation, albeit by a hybrid means, not just murdering Palestinians, but trying to actually implement a neocolonial agenda that has at its center ensuring that Israel remains in full control.
Okay, just want to kind of like take the conversation back, and we do want to start speaking about the president also at some point. But your reporting goes back to the late 90s in the region, where you actually started visiting the region, visited Iraq, and this was even preceding both 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan and Iraq 2003. And obviously, the journalist that you've become has been informed by that period of history. Your first, I think it was your first book, the big, long treatise on Blackwater and what they were doing. During that period, what you learned about the way the U.S. military operated, the fact that it was, openly hiring these contractors at exorbitant prices, who, were free to start, to carry out atrocities where they had much more ability to not have to account than the U.S. military did, which also doesn't account a lot for its own crimes. But how does what you see from that period, and you've seen the evolution of that, you've probably seen, at least talk of a more humane position from the devastation of the Iraq War, but now you see like something else entirely. It's a whole new beast. And just how is, in your mind, given the long reporting history you have, what's the trend been like?
I'll go back even further than that, because you're asking a really important question. In 1962, when Dwight Eisenhower gave his farewell address to the American people as he was leaving office, he warned about the rise of the military-industrial complex. And Eisenhower himself was a career military officer. He was a general. And so he understood the history and evolution of the American armed forces. But what he was talking about at the core was that when you link corporate profits to the proliferation of war, then the incentive for peace or to avoid conflict or to engage in diplomatic resolution disappears, because you now have a profit motive that is linked to the advancement of war policy. And you really saw in that era that often is spoken of as the Cold War, when in actuality there was nothing cold about it. It was hot wars in small form all around the globe. You really saw then the rise of powerful weapons corporations, who then also owned media outlets. And these weapons corporations were pouring money into the election campaigns of American politicians. And you can draw a direct line between the acceleration of the American involvement in Vietnam that then turned into the full-blown war that the United States was waging in Vietnam, all the way to the present day, where we've been on this constant arc of increased profits as war spreads. And when by the time you had the 9/11 attacks take place, the U.S. military was already fully engaged in radical privatization, but a lot of it was in the realm of weapons production. What we saw after 9/11 was that the CIA and U.S. Special Operations Forces and the State Department, by the way, began to utilize in an unprecedented manner armed private contractors that, if you study history, should have rightly been labeled as mercenaries. But they kind of create these terms to try to obfuscate reality and make you think that this is just a more efficient private sector solution for big military operations. And the most notorious of these companies was the Blackwater mercenary firm, started by a man that I think can clearly be called a Christian nationalist or Christian supremacist, Eric Prince, who came from a billionaire family. And his sister was Trump's Secretary of Education during his first term, Betsy DeVos. And she married into the DeVos family, the owners of the Amway Corporation. And those two families, Eric Prince's family and the DeVos family, merged together like the monarchies of old Europe. And they began pouring money into the rise of what became known as the radical religious right. And Eric Prince himself did something that a lot of children of billionaires don't do. He enlisted in the Navy SEALs. He had some deployments around the world, but his notoriety came after he left the Navy SEALs, and he became the creator of Blackwater. And prior to 9/11, he was focused more domestically in the United States and was thinking that, for instance, responding to school shootings was sort of going to be part of the bread and butter. So they created a mock high school, and they would have training for how to deal with school shooters. But 9/11 happens, and these guys start to see dollar signs. And so what Prince did in a kind of, it was brilliant in its own way, was he took people whose entire careers were in the military or in the CIA, but then had left the service, and he repackaged them as a private commodity to then be purchased at a very high price by the United States for two reasons. One, to expand the footprint as the U.S. began waging these wars around the world. Donald Rumsfeld famously said the world is a battlefield now. But then on the other hand, for deniability to be built in. When private contractors were being killed in Iraq, their deaths were not listed in the official death count. They could work on covert operations for the CIA or for the U.S. military. And so what we saw was the rise of not just weapons corporations, but actual small private armies that could be rented by the U.S. government at great cost to the taxpayer that served this dual mission. And at the core of it also was to conceal the full extent of American involvement. And contractors have been involved at every level of American military operations, and it's linked directly to what we're seeing right now with Israel's genocidal war. The same concepts are at play. Israel is using Palestine and Palestinians as a proof of concept testing ground for its weapons, for new tactics in warfare, for new forms of mass surveillance. And so what we saw at the beginning of 9/11, which started on a relatively small scale, has become the way of waging war now.
Okay, so I mean, I do want to explore more the thing you said about how this kind of like use Gaza as a lab for awful Western weapons testing. But before we get there, I mean, it's clear now that Israel is functioning as a garrison state, right, for the USA. It also, I mean, not to say Israel doesn't have its own agency, it does. It's probably, the dog that barks that America hates in a way, not hates in the sense that it just doesn't behave and bites the people it doesn't want it to bite, or bites more than it should. It's clearly become an unsustainable project. They are exposed. They're fighting wars against Syria. They continue to bomb Lebanon. Gaza and the West Bank is abhorrent. They struck Qatar. And you mentioned earlier on, it's not clear who leads who, and it's almost like a case of clearly Israel is leading, but America kind of wants to rein them in, but at the same time, their inability to rein it in does give America leverage over its Arab allies. Because, I mean, the Arab allies would be like, we really want Israel to behave. But if Israel starts behaving, then that leverage is lost, right? So there's two aspects of this kind of contractual thing. There's this geopolitical garrison state game, and then there's the lab aspect. Let's address the first and then come back to just the sort of the ins and outs of how this weapons testing is then exported. And examples of because currently that's the lab. So what's the previous examples of when something was cooked up and used by Israel or contractors or something else and then was exported?
Not to dwell on the question of sort of who's in control, I think there shouldn't be any illusion that the entire establishment of what is called the State of Israel, this was a European settler colonialist state that the United States very quickly recognized as its outpost in the Middle East. It's why, no one wants to talk about the fact that Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons. Is Israel, whether there's a quote unquote liberal government in power or there's a fanatical right-wing government in power, it has always operated with minor disagreements. Obama had some minor disagreements. Maybe he was stronger on the issue of illegal settlements than other presidents. Debatable, but let's say that's true. But in general, it's been one of the established givens in the Middle East that the United States is going to endorse and bankroll the worst excesses, the most extreme violence of Israel. I mean, Joe Biden, who was in power for 50 years, was probably the most dedicated political Zionist to ever ascend to the presidency. I don't think Donald Trump would be able to give you the actual definition of Zionism. I literally don't think he could articulate what Zionism is. Joe Biden was an ideological president who, although, he was half brain dead during his administration here, if you go back and you watch speeches or you understand the history of Joe Biden, whether he was fully with it or not, the Joe Biden of those 50 years was in charge of that Gaza genocide, was in charge of that war. And even if he was ruling by proxy because of his mental, strength capacity as it existed in those years, the point that I'm making is that this was a man who fully believed in the ideological premise of Zionism and was willing to use the full force of the United States to empower it. Donald Trump is an erratic, transactional guy. And in his second swing at the presidency, he was bankrolled by Miriam Adelson, who then got a special thank you for him at their reverse Nuremberg trial ceremony at the Knesset when Trump, celebrated his own so-called peace plan. But I think that, political Zionists have much more sway in the current Trump administration than they maybe did in the first term. But I bring these up in answer to your question because I think that it's a mistake to think of the United States and Israel as separate entities when you look at the long arc of history. I think there are minor disagreements, but the general project of a greater Israel has consistently been supported by the United States. Now, what's interesting, and you alluded to this, is that Trump, for his own reasons, many of which have to do with his family's private businesses, his personal interests, not the interests of the U.S. government or his presidency, he has a new array of Arab Gulf states that he's become very close to. Qatar is an interesting example. I think that there is a genuine closening, deepening relationship between the Trump administration and Qatar. We all see it in plain view. At the Doha Forum, when you listen also to Qatari officials, they're careful in how they offer any criticism of the United States. They're very diplomatic. But also you get a sense that they genuinely do see some partnership, with the Trump administration. And I think that has created a challenge for Israel in a sense, because Trump is not thinking of this as a political Zionist. He's thinking of things as business deals. That's why his so-called peace plan is an up in the air affair. Who's going to sit on this board of peace? What's its power going to be? Those are questions we should talk about. Who's going to make money off of the Gaza question? So I think we're in an unprecedented time, and I think certainly the Trump administration as an entity fully supportive of Israel. Trump as a businessman making some very interesting moves, particularly with Gulf Arab countries.
And also I think there's a whole legacy of he wants to be seen as a peacemaker, not that he understands peace or its intricacies or what it really means.
I don't think he understood how the Nobel Peace Prize process worked when he rushed this through. I think he legitimately thought, I can get in under the wire and they're going to vote for I don't think he understood it was already done.
He also realizes he's got a few more years, and so he could do that. And I think it's very much a grandiose, I want to be remembered as a great human being who did great things, and greatness, of course, is, in his perspective, is something else to how we would think of greatness. But just to sort of come back to Gaza itself, right now, one of the contractors that we all know about in Gaza, or we should know about, was because Gaza is very much Israel's war, but it may be very soon filled with contractors.
Yeah,
instead of a multinational army, if that ever happens. But GHF, right? Tell me how GHF's arrival, what's the genesis of that moment? It's not now, it's many, many years ago. So just draw the broad arc for us of how do we get to a situation where there's this organization called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or William again, that does the crimes that GHF end up doing.
When the state of Israel was established, and the Nakba was unleashed, which was the first massive wave of ethnic cleansing and annihilation attempts against the Palestinians by the Zionists that were put in power and in charge of this new state. The United Nations certified the right of Palestinians to return as this was happening, and they established a United Nations program, UNRWA, whose mission was not just to provide services to Palestinians who had been displaced, but to also ensure that they had a right to return to the places that they were displaced from. Israel has always viewed that as a threat, the existence of this UN agency as a threat. And UNRWA, particularly in Gaza, but not exclusively, was the primary provider of education. They ran networks of schools. They were the premier provider of basic life essentials. Particularly during the early phases of the genocide, UNRWA became the lifeline for Palestinians. When Israel imposed its blockade and lockdown Gaza, the only entity that was capable of distributing food and other life essentials was UNRWA. And we've seen a vicious smear campaign against, Palestinians of every stripe of society. Doctors are Hamas, hospitals are Hamas command centers, journalists are Hamas, children are future Hamas. It's, this whole thing. But they really went to war against UNRWA. And when Netanyahu resumed the full-scale genocide after Israel unilaterally violated and left the January 2025 ceasefire agreement, March 2nd, they impose a full blockade on Gaza. Nothing enters the Gaza Strip. March 18th, they resume the scorched earth terror bombing, burning children alive in tents, murdering more journalists, killing thousands and thousands more Palestinians. They then say, well, we're only going to allow, quote unquote, aid to come into Gaza if it's under Israel's full control, because we can't let any of the aid go to Hamas. Now, David Satterfield, who was the person from the Biden administration in charge of dealing with humanitarian aid, after leaving office, said that he never saw any evidence that Hamas had taken any significant quantity of aid. Facts don't matter in this equation, but they concocted this idea to have a private company that they, again, call Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. They're going to come in and they're going to be the ones with U.S. private security company, UG Solutions, coming in, bringing veterans of the U.S. military, very similar to the Blackwater model. They're going to come in and they're going to, quote unquote, secure these aid sites. And Palestinians are going to be able to safely come and they're going to receive their aid and ensure that Hamas is not going to take control of it. The only real evidence of any looting that exists are from Palestinian gangs linked to the Israeli government, including that run by Yasser Abu Shabab, who was recently killed. Also was a Wall Street journalist columnist. But I hope people send condolence letters to the Wall Street Journal on it. Yeah. It's sick that they called it the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, but it just shows you how effective UNRWA had been, because when the GHF comes in and it sets up its operations, first of all, it was totally chaotic. They had concertina wire, looked like concentration camp type infrastructure built up. Palestinians are desperate because they're under a forced starvation campaign by Israel. They start lining up, and within hours of these operations starting up, you have your first fatalities of Palestinians being shot as they're waiting to get aid. And in those boxes themselves was like just quantities that you would get at like a bodega or something. These weren't life essentials. It didn't include anything to address the fact that women were facing a crisis where they couldn't breastfeed anymore because of the severe levels of malnutrition. You had children that were born into a world where they never had any meat, they never had any actual protein, where mothers were having to use dates squeezed into a cloth as a replacement for breast milk, and children's lives were then put at risk by having to think of alternative ways of feeding them. But what it amounted to is you have a pathetic box that they say is aid, and they're constantly bragging about how many boxes they distributed. But then Palestinians start lighting up, and it's first dozens, then hundreds, and as many as more than 2,000 Palestinians were killed while waiting or seeking aid during this period when the so-called GHF was in place. And the entire reason that was set up at the beginning was to focus them on the south and try to compel or force Palestinians to move from other parts of Gaza down to the south to be able to receive any aid. Palestinians are a steadfast people, and we've seen repeatedly that they have really tried to never leave, even if all that's there anymore is rubble. But we've watched this ever-shrinking killing cage be manufactured by the U.S. and Israel, where they're trying new tactics to try to force Palestinians to the Mawasi Desert along the sea, or where they're saying, well, we're going to build an encampment in Rafah and we're going to make it into a safe city so Palestinians can go there. It's like watching the Matrix, or some kind of Hunger Games for Palestinians that has been televised on live stream for more than 2 years. And the GHF was part of a broader war that Israel has been waging for decades against UNRWA. And I think that what we're seeing now is the Israelis are in control of more than 50% of Gaza. If you look at it, that you can draw a line from the north of Gaza down, and then it cuts across Rafah. So the Israelis are blocking the only international border that Palestine has in Gaza, which is to the Egyptians. The Egyptians claim that it's open both ways from their end, but that the Israelis are blocking it. And then all of the other points where aid would come in are dependent on the Palestinian 48 territory, the territory now known as Israel, that was Palestine prior to the creation of the state. So it's an entirely surrounded people, but Israel now is in control of more than 53% of it, and they're erecting an infrastructure there. They're comparing it, some American officials, to a green zone, and the plan seems to be, and there's American contractors, by the way, that are coming in to build this infrastructure. The plan seems to be to create little pockets that they're calling like alternative safe communities, and to entice Palestinians to go from the areas that they still are blockading and refusing to deliver the agreed upon life essentials, and to say, well, come on over to this part of it, and you can escape Hamas, and you can come here and we'll give you food. We're going to set up mobile home units. You can have medical care. And it seems that part of the plan is to entice them to come there by saying there's food here, but there's not food there, and then eventually figure out a way to deport them and get rid of them and remove them from their land. That's why I say that in a way, Donald Trump saved Israel's war of annihilation project from itself, because the world was waking up. Netanyahu is an indicted, suspected war criminal right now. The world understands clearly what Israel is. But for the United States, Netanyahu would be in handcuffs. But no European nation is going to arrest him. No one wants to defy the United States, particularly under Donald Trump. So what kind of world are we living in, where the Israelis are waging their war of annihilation? Trump's peace plan is being called, a ceasefire. The Israelis have killed more than 350 Palestinians. Israel's in control of more than 50%. They're building a so-called green zone where they say they're going to get Palestinians to come, and everyone knows that the objective is to try to deport them to another country, to remove them from their land. So, we're in a perilous moment, and it's disturbing to watch how many, particularly Arab and Islamic nations, they all understand exactly what's happening. I think the best interpretation of what they're doing is that they desperately wanted a ceasefire to happen. They felt that they had to capitulate to Trump's framing of it and to constantly be fluffing his ego in order to make it happen. And they think they're going to be able to sort of negotiate now. It's a very open question. I think Israel is winning this situation, even if there are some poison pills in it for Netanyahu and for the agenda. Trump really did save them so that they can continue on with their policy. They just have to deal with some hurdles right now.
I mean, that's like the reason you have a boss. The boss always kind of saves your ass when you behave as a brute, right? And I think Trump obviously is saving them in very sort of a personal business interest way, but I do think there would have been some other manifestation of an American regime, like, kind of helping and helping Israel out of this. I think Biden was trying to do that with Blinken, for example. What do you think is going to happen? So this is clearly, and I completely agree with you, this is the plan. I think you've articulated it very well in terms of like explaining that cruelty and that strangulation of the people of Gaza, and how now there's an incentive for them. And I think there's many people listening to this who would be extremely skeptical of Israel, who believe it's an ethnic cleansing project, but probably hear this and think, given how tragic this is humane's the wrong word, but maybe this isn't the worst thing. And they're saying this is non-Palestinians because at least those people will go somewhere, right? I don't agree with that, but I can empathize with that perspective. So what do you think realistically will happen? And you've talked about sort of the response from the Arab countries, Islamic countries, etc. Let's answer that, and let's get to the kind of things they could have been doing to kind of curtail this.
I mean, I think it's important to also talk about when you have a negotiation or there's a ceasefire. There are at least two parties to a ceasefire. Israel signed a ceasefire agreement with Hamas, not with the Palestinian Authority, not with the people of Palestine. They signed a ceasefire agreement with Hamas. And Israel continues to kill Qassam Brigade fighters. Qassam Brigade is the armed wing of Hamas. There were fighters that were stuck, by some estimates 150 to 200, in tunnels, and Israel has been systematically killing those fighters with whom they have a ceasefire agreement. So I'm bringing this up because Israel has a PhD in violating ceasefires. The late Palestinian poet Rafat al-Arir said that their definition is "you cease and we fire," and I think we see that. So when we're talking about what this deal means, what is the Palestinian component of it? Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and I speak to leaders from both groups because I've been reporting extensively on the negotiations. When Trump's plan was delivered to them, I was speaking throughout their deliberations with various Palestinians involved with the negotiating process, including people on the negotiating team. And they said that they recognized that they had to thread a needle, because while Hamas did win a democratic election, this was 20 years ago. Mahmoud Abbas has not allowed elections to happen since then, national elections in Palestine. Hamas said, we don't have the mandate to negotiate this 20-point plan. This cuts to the heart of the Palestinian liberation struggle. It cuts to the heart of ensuring that there is a unified Palestinian territory that stretches between the West Bank and Gaza. Even if you talk about the so-called two-state framework, the Palestinian position on that has been pre-June 4th, 1967 borders with Jerusalem as the capital. Even Hamas, in its revised charter in 2017, said that if it's the democratic will of the Palestinian people, we will accept a state along those lines. No one talks about that. They refer to decades-old Hamas documents, but in 2017, Hamas's charter was updated. That is the official position of Hamas. So Hamas says, in the face of the Trump ultimatum, let's say, we can't negotiate on behalf of all of Palestinians because we are not all of Palestine. We are Hamas, or we are Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but we have to deal with a very diverse society. So they threaded a needle and they said, we will negotiate the terms for an end of the acute genocide, which means an exchange of captives. So for the first time in all of the negotiations, Hamas negotiators said, we will agree to the immediate release of all living Israeli captives and the exchange of all bodies of deceased captives, with the caveat that there are some that we know are buried under the rubble from Israeli bombings, and we'll need time to locate those bodies. Israel has lied repeatedly and said Hamas is in violation of the ceasefire. This was part of the talks. Trump is aware of it. Steve Witkoff is aware of it. Jared Kushner is aware of it. They just let the Israelis keep on lying about it. And that they would negotiate terms for the resumption of life-essential deliveries to the Gaza Strip in accordance with the terms from the January ceasefire. That's all that Hamas and Islamic Jihad agreed to. I'm emphasizing this because if you read the Israeli press or even the U.S. press, you would think that there was a broader agreement in place. That's all that Hamas agreed to. They didn't agree to disarm. They didn't agree on any of the terms that Trump and others are talking about the deployment of an international force. So you have a broad cross-section of Palestinian groups. Dr. Mustafa Barghouti has been here with us in Doha. This is a well-respected Palestinian physician, political leader. He came in second in the 2005 presidential election behind Mahmoud Abbas, the last time Abbas has allowed himself to go up for election. He's been one of the people spearheading an intra-Palestinian dialogue. And in July of 2024, 14 Palestinian political factions, including Hamas and Fatah, the ruling party of Mahmoud Abbas, all agreed on a set of principles that were an attempt to ensure Palestinian unity in the face of the genocide and in questioning what is going to happen after the genocide ends in Gaza. And people can go online, they can read it, they can read about it. I bring this up because right now, what is happening is that the U.S. and Israel are implying that there's no Palestinians to talk to. And so what Trump is doing is, on the one hand, they're demonizing Mahmoud Abbas, the 90-year-old head of the Palestinian Authority, and characterizing him as a terrorist and not allowing him to go to the United Nations. But there is no greater bootlicker in Palestinian society than Mahmoud Abbas. And it's no matter how much sycophancy he engages in, no matter how much he serves not only the United States agenda, but Israel's agenda. His forces cleared the way for Israel's greatest siege of the occupied West Bank since 1967. In December of 2024, the Palestinian Authority security forces start attacking armed resistance outposts in the West Bank. And then a month later, Israel launches a massive ethnic cleansing operation, displacing 40,000 Palestinians from Jenin and other refugee camps in the occupied West Bank. No matter what Mahmoud Abbas does, he's too Palestinian even for the Israelis. Mahmoud Abbas, who just issued a decree law that is seeking to ban not just Hamas, but also people like Mustafa Barghouti, who controls no armed force, from participating in Palestinian elections unless they agree to the terms of Oslo and the quartet principles of the United States, European Union, Russia, and United Nations, which say that Palestine must be disarmed. It must be a disarmed state, that Palestine must recognize the state of Israel and must recognize the terms of Oslo, which was a capitulation of 78% of historic Palestinian territory. Those are out of sync with the mainstream views in Palestinian society, and Abbas just issued a law Right now, it just applies to local elections, but it's believed it's going to apply to national. That is saying anyone that doesn't agree to those terms is not allowed to run for political office in Palestine. It's taking Palestinianism out of Palestinian politics. So this man, who the U.S. has sanctioned, has denied entry into the United States to attend the United Nations, they're saying, well, this is going to be our veneer of Palestinian legitimacy, but even he's too Palestinian. So what we're seeing now is, who do they negotiate with? What should be happening is that Palestinians should have the right to the diverse fabric of their society being represented. By using Mahmoud Abbas, who on the one hand they characterize as a terrorist, but on the other hand they kind of need him to put this stamp on it, what they're saying to the Palestinians is, you will never, ever have an opportunity to negotiate for your own rights. We will only do it through this little Vichy authority that was supposed to have a 5-year mandate in 1994, and a 90-year-old guy masquerading as a head of state who was elected to a 4-year term in 2005. That's who they're saying is going to be the stamp of legitimacy on this. This isn't a Hamas extremism. All Palestinian factions, with the exception of the clique around Mahmoud Abbas, are saying this is a neo-colonialist plan. We can't accept these terms. And why is it that Palestinians don't have a right to actual democracy? When we elect the wrong people, you lay siege to us. You put sanctions on us. When we demand elections, you say, well, yes, but only the people that agreed to this agreement that most Palestinians are against from 1993? That's the terms that you have to accept? They're not saying just you can't be a member of Hamas. This would apply to any Palestinian political actors who have a critical analysis of Oslo or have a critical analysis of Israel illegal seizure of Palestinian lands. It's remarkable. Almost no reporting on it in the Western media on these laws that are being pushed through. And they're all being drafted in concert with Emmanuel Macron's office in France, other European leaders. The United States is behind the scenes working on it. Palestinians don't have a chance to see the draft constitution that's being written right now, but Emmanuel Macron has. How is this possible? How is it possible? It's possible because of the project that you and I have been sitting here talking about.
Yeah.
You know?
No, it's exactly that. It's literally like going back 200 years, and there's literally a bunch of people in Paris, and in this case, DC. Normally, they wouldn't be 200 years in London, drafting how arrangements for the natives without the natives being involved. And I think that's exactly how they see it. You've spoken about the response from the region, and we are at the Doha Forum, and I think there's representatives here from every single country in the region. Certainly, I mean, if not every country in the world, quite frankly. The region has reacted differently. It's been tricky. While I don't agree with the stance that the region has generally taken, I do acknowledge that it's probably quite tricky for them. How do you think they could have navigated this space?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a level on which it's easy for you or I to sit here and sort of critically dissect what happened and decisions that were made. I think in the most generous analysis that we could offer, you're dealing with a totally unpredictable character in Donald Trump, who also is simultaneously has his children running around the world making business deals that are only one step removed from him, and it's sort of a technical distinction, to step away. So they're in a bind in how they deal with Trump. I think that the most positive spin one could put on it is that when you look at the heads of intelligence or the prime ministers or foreign ministers of the most important countries that negotiated this, Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt, that they weren't just taking into account what is in the interests of Palestinians. I think there was a genuine sense that the populations of all these countries wanted that genocide to end. There was a genuine sense that Palestinians in Gaza wanted a deal to be made. And I think that they also felt that the best deal that they could get in dealing with Donald Trump was the one that they got. However, when Netanyahu and Trump came to announce his 20-point plan, the foreign minister of Pakistan, Turkish officials, and others they said that they watched the announcement and got the readout like everyone else of the 20-point plan, and it was a different document than these Arab and Islamic countries had been shown. There were representations, for instance, about the West Bank that were then taken out of the agreement. There were things injected into it. And we now know from reporting that's been done about what happened in the days leading up to Trump and Netanyahu announcing the 20-point so-called peace plan, that Ron Dermer, who was Netanyahu's top political advisor, sort of also kind of his like Roger Stone, his hatchet man, although interestingly, he's no longer working for Netanyahu officially. He meets with Witkoff and Jared Kushner, and they put in terms and change language at the 11th hour. I genuinely believe that that they played a very dirty trick on Arab and Islamic countries. But then, with the exception of a few officials making that clear, people just sort of swallowed it and said, yeah, we're dealing with Trump. Trump used negotiations with Iran as a cover to facilitate 12 days of massive bombing of Iran. So you're dealing with a totally dishonest, pathological liar. But you're also dealing with someone who wants something from you. It's almost like he's openly corrupt, saying, like, pay me money. So yeah, they're navigating, in real political terms, they're navigating an unprecedented head of state of the most powerful nation on earth. On the other end of it, I think that the Palestinian negotiators were put under enormous pressure and I think threats were made against them that I don't, no one from Hamas told me this. I find it difficult to believe that there weren't threats made about Hamas's ability to keep its officials alive and safe in a variety of countries if they didn't take the deal. Again, it's speculation on my part, but I would say it's informed speculation because you did actually have Qatar bombed.
Exactly. I was just going to say that the bombing now informs that speculation, yeah.
And I think, I listened very closely to what the prime minister / foreign minister of Qatar said when he was asked about this by Tucker Carlson at the Doha Forum. He was asked, about Trump's reaction to it, and the Qatari minister said that Trump seemed genuinely angered and surprised by it. I find that hard to believe. I'm not saying I find it hard for him to believe. I find it, as someone who covers and reports on the U.S. military and covert actions, hard to believe. Let's think about this. August 18th of 2025, Hamas informs the Qatari and Egyptian mediators that they have accepted the terms of the Witkoff framework. This was a 13-point ceasefire plan that was on the table last summer. On August 18th, Hamas accepts it. Israel doesn't issue a formal response to it. The Qataris said it was 98% of the Israeli demands represented in what Hamas had agreed to. This would have been a phased ceasefire deal, similar terms to what ended up being the deal in October. No response happens. Witkoff and other American officials join Israel in saying Hamas is rejecting peace, even though they've literally just accepted it. I think the Qatari officials were losing their minds. They're saying, no, but they've actually accepted it. Both Egypt and Qatar were saying, we should be moving forward now. Nothing happens. Then Trump sends through an intermediary a 100-word document to Hamas that we obtained and reported on, basically saying, I'm going to talk to Israel about stopping the genocide if you agree to release all of the hostages at once. It was a very, very short thing. I talked to Hamas officials about it. They really didn't know what to make of it. It was literally around, I think it was 103 words long in English. And then the Qatari mediators got a little bit more of a fleshed out document and they give it to Hamas. Hamas then, their negotiating delegation is meeting in Doha on September 9th when Israeli warplanes launch between 10 and 12 missiles at the offices of Hamas and at the residence of Hamas's political leader in Gaza, Dr. Khalil al-Hayya. They don't kill any of the senior leadership of Hamas. They don't kill any of their negotiators. Instead, they kill Khalil al-Hayya's son. They kill his secretary, and then they killed a handful of assistants / bodyguards. They were young guys that I met many of these guys that accompany, Hamas officials, and they killed a Qatari security official. The idea that Qatar, a nation that when Iran was bombing it, was using its U.S. provided air defense systems in coordination with the United States, a nation that hosts U.S. Central Command, the most important geostrategic American base in the region, that somehow a stealth attack was able to take place without the United States being aware of it. At a minimum, Trump and the United States government were aware that this was underway and issued a stand-down order to any U.S. military assets in the region, or they greenlit it. The Israelis said quite clearly that they were going to start assassinating Hamas's external leadership. And so I think that was a moment when the message was sent to the broader Islamic and Arab world that there is no line for Israel. And in this case, Trump hemmed and hawed, they shouldn't have done this. And then he signs this unprecedented security agreement with Qatar. But at the end of the day, what happened there, I think, was a great crime because whatever criticisms people want to levy against Qatar, and no nation should be immune from criticism of its own domestic or foreign policies, Qatar has, I think, in a sincere way, tried to serve as a neutral mediator in this situation. If anything, I think that they've been, you could say that they've been too generous to the Israeli position at times in the pressure that's been put on Hamas. It's also true of the Egyptians. It's not meant to be a criticism of the Qataris. I'm just saying that those of us who recognize this is a clear genocide with a clear aggressor could say, why should Israel be given any concession in this? The world should just be demanding they stop. So to then bomb that country that is the headquarters of the most important American, strategic asset in the Middle East, it's shocking. I don't believe for 1 second that the United States wasn't aware of it. I think the question is, were they directly involved with it?
Okay. No, you mentioned the Qatar foreign minister speaking to Tucker Carlson. Another, I guess, the other big sort of headline event that happened at this Doha Forum was yesterday with Christian Ramaphosa speaking to Ahmed Shara, the new president of Syria. Now, Syria has made it very clear they are attempting to normalize with Israel. It's clear also that they've allowed Israel to neutralize its military capability. They're obviously irritated, and he mentioned that himself. He's mentioned both of these things actually himself, that Israel is going beyond that. They have extended the occupation of the Golan Heights. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is been on a path to normalization for a long while. UAE is on a path to but they've already normalized. How has this genocide? How do you think it plays into this? And this is quite a tricky question. But if you were the new president of Syria, a country that's been devastated by civil war, you have sanctions against you. You have a population that's very big, 20 million people. 10 million of them were displaced during the war. 7 million of them externally, right? Internally, 3 million externally. What would you do?
I'm not an advisor to any of these kinds of people. There's a reason why I'm not in government, and I prefer to be a journalist. Look, it was an interesting interaction with Christiane Amanpour. She also said, you used to be a terrorist. And I thought Shara's answer was actually interesting. If you stripped away the context or what we know about, Abu Jolani, Shara, and you just looked at it as in a superficial way, this is the head of state of Syria answering this question. His answer was meticulously correct. And what he did was he offered, I think, what would be a universally accepted definition of terrorism that involves the targeting of civilians to try to achieve political aims that the civilians are not direct combatants and participants in. And basically said, without saying the word, the words United States, said that since, over the past 25 years, this region's been lectured and accused of terrorism, and yet we should look at who are the real terrorists in this region. Just on a basic level, his analysis was absolutely correct. But there's also serious questions about his past, about the units that he was involved with, about the extent to which there was cooperation with U.S. intelligence, about the dirty wars that were waged in Syria, that many nations in this region played a direct role in. In a way, there's some similarities to, and I know, Syria is a very contentious issue in the Arab world, in the Middle East. You have very ferocious opinions about Shara, about what happened. But what I think is undeniable is that the role that the United States played in the brutal, horrifying, massacre-filled decade of war in Syria is a notable one. The CIA engaged in a very large-scale interference campaign where there was financing and weapons deals and support for various armed factions inside of Syria. And it's like no one wants to talk about that. You're not a tinfoil hat wearer when you talk about the role that the United States played in Syria. There should be a thorough inquiry of al-Shara's background, of the forces that took power, how they were able to take power, what's the relationship with Turkey. All of these are questions that we should be asking and analyzing. But Syria is an incredibly diverse country and an ancient civilization and an important country. And what happened when there was a change of government? It comes in the midst of Netanyahu's attempt to totally dismantle what was known as the axis of resistance. We could have a long conversation about whether Bashar al-Assad was actually on the side of the Palestinians or not. There's ferocious opinions on that. But what was the first thing that the Israelis did? They went and they bombed the entire conventional military infrastructure of Syria, wiping out military bases, air defense systems, conventional military capabilities. And then they start to send their invading forces in. And then Netanyahu recently goes and he visits it. And yes, the Syrian president is talking about normalization. but also what military response could the Syrian government offer to a nuclear-armed power, backed, bankrolled, armed, and funded by the United States? So, I'm not a Syria expert. I don't pretend to be. I certainly have a very critical reading of who Shara is and how he came to power and what his background is. But I also think that we often are inverting what our analytical framework should be. Why is it that the United States and Israel have a right to do what they're doing to Syria right now? Yes, it's for Syrians to decide what they think about who should be in charge of their country, what the constitution should look like, what kind of representative democracy they should have, what kind of government they should have. But we, as Westerners, should be saying, what is the dirty role that our states are playing in this? And so, there's the diplomatic game that I think has been very dirty toward the new Syrian regime. But then we have Israel waging an overt hot war against what? A largely, overwhelmingly disarmed population of people who just endured one of the most brutal civil wars in modern history. It's a sickening situation. So, I think the priority for people like you and me and others should be to look at what is the role of our own government in further destabilizing Syria. And this whole call for Arabs or Muslims to be demilitarized or disarmed is a shockingly hypocritical one when you look at what's happening with Israel, where the weapons flow is just nonstop, where the underwriting is just nonstop. What message is the United States sending to Muslim nations around the world? And the idea that Palestine should only be recognized as a state if it's a disarmed, a demilitarized one, what part of history should we be led to believe is actually valid when you say Palestinians exist in their own space where they're not allowed to have any ability to defend themselves against a murderous serial killer that pretends to be a nation state? That's what's being said right now. And, part of the shame in the Arab world and part of why, I think that some of the Palestinian resistance gets demonized is because the Palestinians are in a fight for their very existence. And the people that have been resistance fighters in Palestine are not a foreign force that came in. Hamas isn't a foreign force. Palestinian Islamic Jihad isn't a foreign force. Who makes up Saraya al-Quds, the armed wing of Islamic Jihad? Who makes up the Qassam brigades? Who are those people in the tunnels? These are grandchildren of the Nakba survivors. These are people who grew up in a concentration camp. Yahya Sinwar, who was the head of Hamas, who was killed in battle by the Israelis, not hiding in a tunnel, not hiding behind Israeli captives. Who was Yahya Sinwar? He was born in a refugee camp in Khan Yunis. His entire life was spent watching the Israelis attack his family and his people. He then spends 20 years plus in an Israeli prison. He becomes fluent in Hebrew. He translates the memoirs of the Shin Bet and Mossad heads. He distributes them to other prisoners. I was just with Nail Barghouti, the longest-serving Palestinian prisoner. He was in prison with Yahya Sinwar, was freed briefly during the period when Sinwar himself was freed in the Gilad Shalit deal. But Sinwar himself, his entire biography is about Israel's war of annihilation against the Palestinians. Palestinians have different opinions about Hamas. That's their right. They should debate it ferociously. But we should be honest and accurate when we talk about why is there a Hamas? Why is there an Islamic Jihad? Why was there a Yahya Sinwar? Why was there an Ismail Haniyeh? Why did Hamas win democratic elections? Is it because some foreigners came in and told them? No, it was because this is a natural response to this war of annihilation that was waged against them. And yet that context, you're never allowed to say it. Oh, are you pro-Hamas? I'm not pro-Hamas. I'm not pro-Hamas. I'm not anti-Hamas. I'm pro-truth. I'm trying to state facts. It's for Palestinians to decide what they think about Hamas. We can debate tactics and talk about the politics of armed resistance, but it should be based on facts, on factual information. And this attempt to compare the Palestinian resistance to Al-Qaeda or ISIS is lunacy. These people are not engaged in attacks outside of historic Palestine. You can't categorize this as terrorism. You can debate tactics, but this is not terrorism if what Israel is doing is somehow justifiable. So in a sense, it brings it back to what Ahmed al-Shara was saying. Because he was in Al-Qaeda, because he was in ISIS, Christian Amanpour can say, well, you were a terrorist. Okay, ask him that question. That's fine. It's a fair question. Why don't you ask that question to Israeli officials or American officials for that matter? I see John Brennan, the former CIA director, walking the halls at this Doha Forum. John Brennan is a man who probably belongs on trial somewhere for the crimes he committed as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, one of the main perpetrators of Obama's drone assassination program. And yet he's wearing his badge and walking around this conference a free man. The only legal jeopardy he might be in is some cockamamie indictment Trump is trying to get against him, not at The Hague where people like that actually belong. So yeah, ask the Syrian president those questions. Totally legitimate, but apply those same questions to people like Netanyahu.
Okay, I think everything you said is just, it's the scathing response to that is just, this is clearly, it's colonial times. And I've said this again in the previous interview, but it's almost like this is exactly how, officials from the British Empire or the French Empire would behave, or, independent American troops would behave in terms of thinking about the Native Americans of America, or in terms of, confronting the Zulu tribes and Xhosa tribes in South Africa. I mean, this is just, it's a tactic, and I think we sit in the English-speaking media, we sit in the seat of empire, and so the framing of this is, of course, our violence is legitimate, and the violence of those who are resisting is not. And I think what's really interesting is it's not necessarily a move to demilitarize Hamas, but you said, and it's clear, it's a move to demilitarize the entire region. The only thing they're allowed to do, or that we're happy to, and they're not doing it, they started to diversify, but they can buy weapons from us, which, of course, the US can control, right? But I mean, there is a move, and I'm not sure if it will be successful in the long term, but there is a move that these countries, even some are very, big friends of the USA for 60 years, 70 years, Saudi Arabia, for example, starting to buy some weapons from China via Pakistan, etc. More or less final question. We may have a few responses after this, but we're starting to wind it down. You've obviously clearly very unapologetic. There is a crackdown in the USA on these kind of conversations, if not necessarily, I mean, literally judicially, but also in terms of the environment. I've experienced similar now that I report out of the UK. What people are willing to say on camera is not what they were willing to say 3 years ago. Some people have obviously doubled down and become more vociferous. How do you see that landscape? Do you think that they will actually, I mean, usually people can't control narratives. When they do try to control narratives, it's effective in the short term, but it's not effective in the long term. How do you see all of that playing out?
Look, I mean, what's happening right now in the UK, is a very extroverted representation of what many in the US government right now, I think, would like to do. The criminalization of Palestine action, the arresting of elderly protesters and others for simply stating their support for Palestine action, and the attempt to abuse so-called terrorism laws. When you enter a port or an airport in Britain, you basically don't have any actual rights. And so many activists, lawyers also, and others have had their devices seized and searched. Britain doesn't have the equivalent of a First Amendment as we have in the United States. And for years, even though I'm a fierce critic of the U.S. government, I would always say, but for all of the flaws of the American system, the existence of the First Amendment is of vital importance. And you had a sense that even under horrible regimes in America and presidencies, you could argue the force of the law and that the truth would be on your side when it came to speech issues. There's always been a Palestine exception carved out when they talk about terrorism, but as a starting point, the First Amendment was a great thing. Now there's discussion of expanding material support for terrorism laws in the United States. There's talk of going after the nonprofit status of organizations that are deemed by the administration to be pro-Palestine. It always starts with the most vulnerable people. So you're seeing ICE acting as stormtroopers and going and snatching people and forcibly deporting them. You saw, of course, the Mahmoud Khalil case. Then they start to go after green card holders or legal permanent residents. They're talking about getting rid of of people who were naturalized citizens or being able to go after them. If you study the history of authoritarianism throughout history, we're already in the pendulum swing here. It's happening in the UK. It's happening in the United States. And in the United States, it's ironic because they're doing it in the name of defending free speech. We sit at this conference and we hear Trump administration officials talk about how they're restoring the greatness of the First Amendment, or even Trump's son was talking about it, while at the same time criminalizing a certain form of speech. Support for speech doesn't mean that you defend the right to speech that you agree with. It means you defend the right to speech that you that you disagree with. So I'm very concerned. I don't think journalists are some special class of people. It's just that it is a group of people whose dedication and job is supposed to be about offering the truth or offering people facts that they can use to make informed decisions. So we focus on journalists a lot because they're out there on the front lines of this. But fundamentally, it's just a convenient way of talking about what are our basic rights to speech. And in the case of what's happening in the UK and the United States right now, speech is under massive attack right now. And somehow through the history, I don't know the UK history as well, but I know the US history. The history of all of these so-called terrorism laws can be traced back to criminalizing defense of Palestine. There's been some remarkable academic papers about this that have been published recently too, looking at the origins of these so-called anti-terrorism laws. And therefore, it's no surprise that what we see now, universities being attacked in the United States and capitulating to Trump, what's at the heart of it? It's about Palestine. It's about Palestine. It's always about Palestine when you dig a few layers off the onion.
Jeremy Scahill, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for your time.
And thank you guys for all the great work that you're doing. It's been really incredible to watch how you've grown and expanded.
I mean, thank you for. I think we definitely ride off a lot of what you do, and I think that's probably you do the same. It's a mutualism relationship, and I mean, it's good and encouraging. We've already kind of discussed this already off camera, to see how Dropside sort of come along, the work you guys have been doing, and thanks for the encouragement.
Thank you.
Thank you.